Hello, everybody. Welcome to the California MBA, the Mortgage Quality and Compliance webinar. We're very excited to have you guys here. First off, we will hear from Monica. Our sponsor is Crosscheck Compliance, and we'd love to hear from Monica a little bit more about Crosscheck.
Great, thanks so much, Paula. Good morning, everyone. Crosscheck is a proud and active member of the CMBA, and I have the pleasure of working with a highly qualified team of industry professionals with a broad and deep mortgage-specific experience. We provide a variety of services. A couple I'll highlight today are we do regulatory enforcement and remediation support, especially on the fair lending side, a lot of fair lending program reviews and data analytics. I know there's a lot of activity out there right now, even looking at analysis of individual MSAs by the regulators. We also perform internal audits, including servicer audits, and we do due diligence, the file reviews for securitizations with a specialty in non-QM. We also partner with law firms, and we can perform engagements under attorney-client privilege. Most of you know I enjoy networking in our industry, so don't hesitate to reach out to me directly if you have any questions about Crosscheck, or you need some other referral, or just want to chat about the industry. So thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Monica. And definitely fair lending, huge topic. Data analytics, very important. Which reminded me, I wanted to mention our conference for the California MBA. We're very excited. Early December. It's back in Orange County this year, and we would love to see all of you guys there. We have some great topics we're working on. Getting great presenters. We would just love for you guys to be there. You can already register. The website is up early December, so please, we would love to see you. As you can see on the screen, I'm Paula, VP of Compliance at CMG. Michael is co-chair. We're so glad to have you guys here at the webinar. And the presentation is outsourcing, offshoring, and vendors. Oh my! Because there is so much going on. There's ways that we can save money, which we definitely all need to right now with how the industry's going. So we can learn more today about how we can outsource correctly and compliantly, how to pay attention to what our vendors are doing. So we're very excited to have these great speakers. We have Dr. Paul Vaillancourt from N Contracts, and also Steve Greenfield from Plaza Home Mortgage. Guys, thank you so much for speaking to us today. We're really looking forward to your content. Take it away.
Right. Yes, thanks for the invite. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Paula.
Go ahead, Steve.
No, you're fine, Paul. Carry on.
Well, thanks everybody for the invite today. I know, vendor management, we could really spend a day talking about as opposed to just, an hour. So, we certainly have a lot of great things to go over today. And it's going to be our pleasure to bring it. I'm glad to be joined by Steve Greenfield. He's got a depth of knowledge in the mortgage space specifically, and so I think we're going to have a really great conversation. I know Steve and I, we've talked a couple times and really had a blast talking all things vendor management. So certainly going to bring you a really great hour today. So we can advance the slide. I think the first thing we want to talk about is, we really want to start from the start here and talk about outsourcing, right? So, any outsourced activity that we do means that the financial institution is going to be responsible for making sure that vendor is compliant with laws, regs, rules, etc. And again, I can tell you, from my personal experience, I have heard more times than I care to count, oh, we don't have to worry about that. We have a vendor doing it. Well, that is the wrong answer. That's going to get you in trouble every time, right? Steve, comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with the CFPB, Paul. When you outsource a function, you're not outsourcing the risk. You as a lender maintain that risk. If they screw up, essentially, it's still going to be on you. So essentially, when you do outsource, you're outsourcing a function, not the risk. And therefore, you have to really treat that vendor as an extension of your workforce.
Yep, exactly. And to do that, we need to make sure that we monitor them and stay on top of them, make sure that they're performing to service level standards and their contracts, that they're being compliant. So there's a lot of things that we have to do. But again, we wanted to kind of start from the start here and talk about the responsibilities for outsourcing. Now, if we can go to the next slide, The reason why we have responsibilities for outsourcing is because there's a lot of risk involved with vendor relationships. And we're going to see here, we can talk about risk, that's a whole other day that we can talk about, right? But there are numerous potential categories of risk, but really when we look at the vendor world, there's a convergence of emphasis on certain things, right? So the compliance and legal risk, counterparty risk, reputational risk, strategic risk especially, and op risk, I think would be the main ones, the main pillars there. So when we do vendor management, when we're doing monitoring and all of these things, we're doing it because of the the risks, and we want to keep that in mind when we start to do monitoring and start to put our internal control environment in place. What do we think about that, Steve?
So I think there's probably more risk categories as the industry evolves and as we adopt more technology. So I know there's a slide on cyber later. But again, I think the main pillars of, if you look at a vendor and how they do become that extension, it's not really that much different than how you treat an employee when you're bringing them onto your organization, meaning, looking at the background check, looking at the references. It's kind of like using that common sense of how you treat an employee, and then looking at that, extending that scope into, okay, if this vendor becomes an extension of my service, and ultimately I'm trying to make sure the consumer has a great experience, then looking at these pillars of risk, if you will, really ensure that moving forward, there's no kind of hiccups along the way in that process. So again, if you look at it, some of the lenders that have gone out of business recently, they may be key clients or key clients of other vendors, and that obviously puts financial risk, capacity issues on that vendor. So again, you might have a vendor that maybe a large client has exited their business, that's impacted their financials, and then what does that mean? Does that mean that the vendor has to lay off staff? How does that then roll into SLAs? And obviously that's a service level agreement, but how does that really kind of parlay into performance and how they can support you as a vendor? So I think looking at all those pillars really kind of help you make sure you've got the right partner in place. And Paul, I think we lost audio.
Excellent. Yeah, and I'd also add too, there is so much information. I did.
Great. You're back now. You lost for a second.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I just thought to add here, when we onboard a vendor, when we're doing ongoing due diligence, there's so much information out there that we could look at. So having risk around categories and having 4 or 5 pillars of the type of risk we want to look at is really going to help narrow our focus so that we can focus on the things that matter the most as far as the risk to our institution. So thanks for that. Sorry about the technical difficulties. If we can go to the next slide, please. So in keeping with that theme of risk, and I'll try to keep the camera on, we'll see if it makes a difference or not, I don't know. In keeping with that theme of risk, there are certain things that counterparties can do or vendors can do that might elevate our risk. And there are numerous ones again, and we just really wanted to highlight some of the more common ones here. So we have elevated risk when we have third-party products or services that aren't properly reviewed for compliance. So if you have a legal team, if you have a compliance department, we want to make sure that the contract is reviewed, but also any type of disclosures they give, any type of servicing that they're doing, if they're processing transactions, we want to make sure that that's all reviewed for compliance as well. We want to make sure that operations are consistent with laws, regs, and standards, right? Obviously, we know the CFPB is out there, right? Maybe not on this call, but they're certainly out there. So we want to make sure that we're doing things the right way so that we don't have potential UDAP issues. Again, yeah, so we talked about UDAP. We also want to make sure that we have their compliance with BSA or OFAC. So if we have third parties that are onboarding new customers, processing transactions, especially doing things offshore, for example, we want to make sure that they have a Bank Secrecy Act and an OFAC program that's going to comply so that we don't have any potential issues there. And if you know anything about BSA and OFAC, those fines can be very significant. We'd certainly like to avoid those. And then lastly, we want to make sure we have the proper amount of oversight. So if we're not overseeing these vendors properly, if we're not doing an audit or oversight, we might have some issues because we're going to miss something important that we should be catching. Steve, what do we think?
So I think these are good points, and I think honestly this is probably another hour-long call, but we don't have that time. But I think when it comes to compliance, and even when you're doing like the vetting of a vendor and looking at their plan, you've really got to look at, do they have a compliance management system in place themselves? Because if they don't, it tells you that they've got a weak infrastructure, unless they're outsourcing that expertise, if you will, which isn't unheard of. But again, it's looking at policy and procedures, looking at the resumes of their executives, if you will, making sure that they've got some tenure in the business and that they're really well up on having, compliance calls internally, that they have a compliance standard, and that they're really aware of things that are changing. I mean, just yesterday, actually early this month, New York DFS proposed amendments to the cybersecurity regulations in New York, where again, there's going to be a lot of talk about that. But if vendors aren't aware of those changes that are coming down the pipe, that potentially could put you into a bad spot later on. So making sure that they've got a management or compliance management system in place that's active, that they're constantly looking at, really can help you sleep a little bit better at night, that they're watching what's going on in the market and the regulations.
Yeah. Funny that you mentioned that, Steve, because as we were putting this deck together, I cut out a bunch of stuff about CMS because it wasn't our scope. We could talk about their CMS all day as well. But
Absolutely.
What I like about that, when you say CMS, it's that compliance management system. It's not just do I have a compliance officer? Am I making sure I'm doing things consistent with laws and regs? It's a whole system that they have together to make sure that they're being compliant. And I think that's the important thing that we're looking for. Not just do you have a compliance officer, but do you have a process in place to make sure that you're identifying changes, making them, and that type of thing.
Absolutely, yeah. Even to the extent of, sorry, Paul, I was going to say, even to the extent of having an internal audit function in place. Again, people can buy policy and procedures, and insert their name, but unless that document is actually living and breathing and actually being, recorded regarding, decisions that are made, internal audit will keep, ourselves as a lender and also a vendor honest, to ensure that they're moving in the right direction. So again, whole other topic right there.
Absolutely. So continuing on with the risks here, I know one of the things that we really wanted to talk about as an elevated risk is offshoring. So I can tell you myself, as a background in banking, we didn't do a lot of offshoring. That just wasn't something that was available to us, and really the risk mindset of the smaller shop that I was at the time was that we didn't want to assume those risks regardless of the effectiveness of our vendor management program. So I didn't really have a lot of direct knowledge of this, and so we're going to rely, Steve, on your expertise. But as a risk manager, there are a lot of things that are just kind of obvious that pop up. So when we look at offshoring, we can look at any number of different things, right? So you've got competing federal laws, so you might have enforceability issues of a contract. Data privacy issues, right? Non-public personal. If that data is transferred, routed, stored in a third country, we're going to want to make sure we understand that. We don't know what the infrastructure is like in a third country. So you could potentially run into some operational risk with infrastructure or business continuity issues arising from that infrastructure or lack thereof. Especially nowadays, pretty topical, geopolitical issues. You just don't know what's going to happen out there, and I think we've got a pretty topical discussion of that. Continuity issues, again, we're aware of things that are going on in our country: fire, flood, hurricane. We know kind of where we live and where our vendors are, what might happen. We probably don't have that insight for folks that are outside of the country. And then also licensing and state regulation. I know, Steve, and I hope you're going to expand on this. You talk a lot. You guys are regulated by the patchwork of states that you're doing business in. That's a lot in and of itself. But when you start looking at licensing and state regulations, that could be, that could add a whole other degree of difficulty onto managing your vendors. So those are my comments for offshoring. But again, Steve, I'm going to defer to your expertise here as having more direct contact with offshore vendors.
Sure. So thanks, Paul. So I think I'm in a unique position because I've managed an offshore team directly in a prior life. So I've kind of gone toe to toe with both lenders and vendors when it comes to, should we offshore? So the first thing is there's economies of scale when you offshore. So offshoring shouldn't be a dirty word in the industry. It's there. Vendors have been in place for 10, 20 plus years, which is really a testament to what they're able to do. They're not failing. So if they were terrible vendors and there was tons of risk, maybe lenders wouldn't be so prone to use them. But there are economies of scale, both in cost of service, cost of products, and obviously the idea that, for fulfillment services, work can get done while your operations team are asleep at night. So when they come in, work is being done. They've got more work to kind of be effective and efficient throughout the day. So there's definitely economies of scale there. As far as the licensed activities, I mean, this is one that, is really open to interpretation, but essentially it's something where, as a vendor manager, the board taking on that risk, they've got to work closely with both compliance and legal to understand the state statutes, if you will, but what is allowable as a licensed activity as well. So that's kind of the risk when it comes to offshoring, because again, if you make the error and allow a licensed activity to be performed offshore, you will be in violation of a state, and you probably will be in the news the next day. So that's the type of risk there. As far as the other risks are concerned with offshoring vendors, we know that a lot of offshoring fulfillment vendors are in India, but on the flip side of that coin, you also have a lot of technology vendors with software development engineers, if you will, that are throughout the globe, and a lot of them are in Eastern Europe of all places. So one thing when we talk about the geopolitical issues is that the minute recently when Russia invaded Ukraine, there were actually a lot of tech companies or actually vendors that relied on tech vendors that were actually situated in Ukraine. So obviously it's a horrible experience what's going on there, but at the flip side, people were trying to take out their staff to get them into safe places, but there was a broader impact as well, which meant, again, it kind of has a trickle-down effect when it comes to, will your development life cycle be on track because the development team essentially, holed up somewhere. But again, some of the things that we found was that vendors did have technology teams in Ukraine. And again, what happened to those individuals if they were male and they were over 18? They may have been stuck in Ukraine to actually have to enlist as well, unfortunately. So there's a lot of stuff going in the world right now that really kind of builds on the fact that we really do live in a global economy. So you've really got to look at what's going on, where your vendors are located. And it's not good enough just to look at like where the corporate HQ is. You've really got to know where your vendors are operating, what environmental risks they're prone to, and obviously the geopolitical, unfortunately, right now, as we see in Ukraine. So there's lots of risk there. And again, things like data protection issues and where is it being stored, that's really for any vendor. But there is a perception in the industry like, well, if it's offshore, it's more risky. The good thing is there are data protection laws in place that kind of enforce that protection, if you will. But you've just got to be aware or make sure that your vendor is aware of what they've got to do to protect your borrower data. Because ultimately, like I've said before, they are an extension of your operation. So you are responsible for their actions to a degree.
Yeah, you mentioned, just want to talk a little bit about the war on Ukraine, because I think that's another good example of having a good dialogue and having good two-way communications with your vendor, whether it's offshore or not. Obviously, when that incursion happened, we saw a need to, potentially find out if we had tech teams over there in Ukraine and what impact that's going to have. But it doesn't help if we don't have an avenue to communicate with those vendors and receive that information in a timely fashion. So I think we're going to talk a little bit more about two-way communications and how we can foster that relationship later. But I also think that's kind of an important thing to mention now, because we need to have that communication. So when things change in the business, risks arise or something that happens, we're able to identify it and then decide how we want to react to that. But while we're on the subject of offshoring, Stephen, I want to again defer to you and maybe put you on the spot a little bit. But you mentioned some kind of do's and some don'ts, and I wanted to just maybe get for the folks on the call, if you can, because again, you're the expert in that situation. So on the economy of scale side, what type of vendors are we seeing, or are you seeing industry-wide that might be beneficial, offshore vendors because of that economy of scale? What type of products or services are they providing?
So, I mean, really, they're working in the loan file, Paul. So it could be as simple as data entry or pulling products that actually provide data to, the onshore underwriter. But I mean, these are all vendors that are performing, essentially they perform the heavy lifting. And I always think of it like this. The offshore vendor isn't really being used to replace your internal staffing, because I think there is obviously great value in internal onshore staff, because they are really the experts in the industry. But the offshore folks, they really do complement what we're doing today on a day-to-day basis. But, you know, from a high level, it's really the fulfillment services that, you know, if it's looking at files and quality control, looking at reviews of a loan that closed against guidelines. So there's a lot of manual processes and also ordering products to help the onshore team.
Excellent. And then let's turn that around a little bit. Are there any types of services for offshore vendors that might be enticing because it might add value, but we might want to think about the risks involved before we enter into that type of arrangement?
Well, I think actually it's the same answer really. If you look at the cost of doing business with an offshore team, certainly if you look at what it might cost to offshore a file to, let's say, India compared to the US, for essentially fulfillment services that are more kind of data driven, there's going to be just, you know, from purely what does it cost for the dollar versus a rupee, if you will, there's going to be economies of scale right there. So it's very, I mean, they're very intertwined, if you will. Interesting.
Yeah. Excellent. So that's a great discussion of the offshoring risk, and I think that was one of the main tent poles that we wanted to hit today. So excellent. So if we could move slides, please. All right. So I think the next we wanted to spend the bulk of our time really talking about the vendor management lifecycle, right? So we wanted to talk. One of the bullet points was talking about how we onboard tech vendors, but really, if we look at that in the context of the vendor lifecycle, I think the whole picture is going to make a lot more sense for our folks that might not have the depth of experience in vendor management, that might be having, you know, doing other jobs and being the part-time vendor manager, that kind of thing. Because we see that in my business, we see that far too often as well. And so we really want to try to talk about core competencies and the basic concepts of this. So really, the vendor management lifecycle we can see here, we want to start with planning. We want to use that plan to start due diligence when we're starting to think about entering into a relationship with a vendor. Once we've done that initial due diligence, or maybe what we call a pre-screen, we want to negotiate a contract. And then once we have that contract signed, it's going to be important that we monitor that relationship on a periodic and ongoing basis, because those relationships change and the underlying risks change. And then because of the life cycle, we're going to monitor that all the way through the termination or offboarding of that vendor. And so we're going to get into some of the details, but Steve, any other comments on life cycle?
I mean, this is where the rubber meets the road. So if you get this wrong, you're in a whole lot of trouble, because, you know, again, once you're under contract, those are the terms of your relationship. It doesn't matter how friendly you might be with your vendor / partner. At the end of the day, your contract terms are the contract terms. So from a vendor manager perspective, I want to make sure that while I want to make sure that the contract is fair for both parties, I want to make sure that my organization is protected. You know, there's a saying that, you know, good people make stupid decisions. So I want to make sure that I'm protected for the long run, for essentially the entire length of that relationship. But again, it does start at planning. Planning could really be like pre-contract due diligence and actually scoping out what that vendor is going to do, looking across your organization. Do you already have a vendor in place that offers that service? You'd be amazed at how many times people go after the new shiny product without looking at their own vendor database to see if they've got something that also could meet those needs. But looking at pre-contract due diligence is key, because that's really aimed at looking at, like, are there any red flags that I should be aware of before I go further down this process? So again, if you think about the data that you can that you can request from a vendor, that's great. You can get the licenses, you can get W-9s, but they don't really tell you anything. But if you look at maybe other public sources, if it's maybe a commercial credit report on the vendor itself, you're looking at things like Glassdoor for reviews to see if there's a staff churn issue. Obviously, that's going to impact operational and SLAs down the road. And then looking at LinkedIn, like what's the vibe of that vendor? Are they up and coming? Are they new? Are they experienced? Are they seeing lots of complaints? It's that type of pre-contract due diligence that can help you get a little bit more comfortable with what the next part of that relationship can perform.
Yeah, and I love that. I was going to bring that up earlier when we were talking about onboarding, and you know, we can certainly glean a lot from that vendor due diligence package that we're asking for, right? But we have to, you know, if we want to really do our homework, the next step is, you know, there's all kinds of publicly available information out there, as you said, Glassdoor, LinkedIn, those types of things. That should really be part of your strategy, whether it's for vendor onboarding, pre-screening, or ongoing, right? There's a wealth of information and knowledge out there. Obviously, I use a lot of that as a vendor manager, Steve. I know you do. And we can't really just rely on what the vendor gives us, because that's really not the full story. The other thing I like to mention here, because we're not going to really talk too much about planning, is that in my business, I see institutions of all sizes. And what I typically see is in some of the larger folks is that the vendors don't necessarily correspond with any type of strategy or execution of that strategy, right? We get big enough to a point where we're just putting on vendors because line of business says, hey, I need this vendor, right? And so it's definitely something that I would caution, for you folks on the call is, when we're in the planning phase, let's make sure we have an understanding of why we need this vendor and how they're going to help us execute strategy. Because we may come to the realization that we don't need this vendor, or as Steve mentioned, hey, we have another vendor that can help us and we don't need to onboard someone else. And then also, I think lastly, for those folks that are on the call that are new to vendor management, and this is something new and different to you, if I had to pick one slide that's going to help you early on, it's going to be this one. And obviously they'll give you this after the presentation. So this is really the start of things, so you might want to bookmark this one. All right, so if we can go to the next slide. Risk, classifying vendors. We've got two different types of risks. So those of you that aren't risk professionals, I'll give you the 30-second version. We're under an obligation, from the regulators to risk rate our vendors. Well, what does that mean? Well, we have two different types here. We're going to want to do an inherent risk assessment, right? So let's going to look at the vendor and that vendor's risk without applying any of the control environment that we might have in our business. Residual risk is going to be a secondary evaluation. Once we understood their inherent risk, it's going to look at, here's my control environment over these vendors. I've got monitoring, I've got these types of things, I've got a program in place, etc. Now what is the risk after I've applied my control? So you really want to do kind of two phases of that assessment. And then also, we don't want to do this risk once a year. And I know this is tough because we've been doing this a long time. We do it once a year, we put it on the shelf, everyone's happy, and we move on. But in today's day and age, when everything is so fast and risks are evolving so fast, the regulatory expectations are changing to the point where we want to make sure that we're doing risk on somewhat of a periodic basis. And so initial and ongoing risk are more than just do it once and put it on a shelf, or we're certainly transitioning that way. Other thing I noticed here is a lot of folks will do a vendor risk assessment just based on the vendor, okay? Their financials, their this, their that, the characteristics of the vendor itself, right? And that's okay, but I think the better way to do it, especially if you're large and complex and you have the ability to do so, is to look at the vendor products and services that they offer, right? Because, take a core processing vendor or someone like that, an LOS, they might offer, 15 or 30 different, lines of business, and you're only really utilizing one or two. So there's a big difference between what they offer and what you're actually utilizing. And I've seen that a lot as well, because it also will change that vendor's risk level over time. I may onboard a vendor for one product or one service, and their risk level is low, but over the course of my relationship with that vendor, I start adding things and adding more products and services, and that will fundamentally change the risk level based on the products and services that I have. So that ongoing monitoring is also important. Steve, would you like to add to that?
No, I think you nailed it, Paul. I mean, when it comes to risk assessments, again, having that annual one actually goes back to even the standard annual vendor management assessment, doesn't it? At the end of the day, it's a point in time. So I always go back to Equifax. If you'd audited Equifax the day before they announced the breach, everything would have looked great. It's when you go back the day later that you realize, oh, we're in trouble here. So I think constantly monitoring them, both in terms of risk, inherent and residual risk, kind of tying that back into your annual process. Because again, if you think about, a lot of folks will maybe perform a annual questionnaire, but they don't actually go back and look at the prior questionnaire that was provided to see if there was an improvement, if any of the findings or the concerns were addressed, and then are they essentially now a non-issue when they come to do year 2 of the assessment. And that ties into essentially how you look at your risk assessment. So certainly when it comes to classifying them, because again, you may be low risk one year, but based on all of those risk factors we talked about, you actually end up being a higher risk vendor, even for the sake of maybe your engagement has increased with the vendor. They were a low risk vendor based on a very minimal spend and maybe no access to borrow information. They've got other products that you're now engaging with. really force you to kind of like rethink how you're managing that vendor. And I think the danger in all of that is that you're trying to put a vendor in like this cookie cutter silo of risk. So you've really got to kind of like join up the dots and really take a holistic approach. And again, and as a vendor manager, my number one piece of advice is do not do this alone. Engage with your risk manager, engage with your compliance manager, even with the lines of business that are using those vendors, because the lines of business that are using the vendor know the vendor performance and the risk probably better than you do as a vendor manager, because they're working with them day in, day out. So you've really kind of got to bring everyone to the party to look at the the classifying of vendors.
Excellent, excellent. Next slide, please. All right, this is one of my favorite ones here, right? So one of the nice things about this is, if you have a good policy and you specifically define your categories of vendors, you certainly don't need to spend a lot of time and effort doing due diligence on everyone, right? But we also have to determine, based on our policy, which vendors we need to review. And we can see we've got a really good graphic here, but for me, what we typically see the regulators do is they have a three-prong test. And if you can answer yes to any one of these three prongs, then you're should be classified as critical, right? So the first one is client impact. If your vendor offers a product or service that would have significant negative impact to your clients, should it cease to function for whatever reason, they're going to be critical. The second one, and probably the most often I see, is going to be access, right? Does that vendor have access to non-public personal? Are they processing data, that type of thing? And of course, if that's yes, it's critical. And then lastly, institutional impact, right? So if that vendor goes away, does it affect your capital, your liquidity, your business plan, the achievement of your objectives, et cetera? So that's my quick soapbox. And Steve, do you have any more of a granular way that you look at your vendors?
No, I mean, I think it ties into your risk assessments. You're going to put your focus, and again, we've got to be real as well for a minute. Vendor management isn't a revenue generating business unit. We can certainly help with managing costs. So sometimes departments, when it comes to vendor management, are pretty small. So essentially, it's about where do you get the most bang for your buck when you're looking at this. And again, from a vendor management perspective, you're going to be looking at those high-risk vendors that essentially could stop your business from operating and obviously could land you in trouble with the regulators. So those are the two kind of pillars that I personally look at when I'm looking at vendors for reviews.
Excellent. Yep. All right. Next slide, please. I think this one really talks more about, we can see the cyclical nature of your vendor, right? So it really takes that first vendor life cycle and puts a little bit more some detail around it, right? And so I'd like to start at, if we look at the top right, we have to decide, again, is this aligning with our strategy? Does this make sense? What are the benefits, right? Gather the data from our resources. Again, doesn't have to be just what the vendors have given us. Based on that data, we can identify those risks. We can make sure that's consistent with our business strategy. And then we start that measuring of the risk process all over again. So again, just a little bit more detail for you. Steve, is there anything that you do in your program that is above and beyond or different than this, or any type of more granularity you'd want to put into this?
Well, I think, if we go back to the topic of, best practices to manage a vendor, it's really about holding the vendor accountable for the contract, making sure that they're meeting the SLAs, and really kind of breaking down really the silos between business unit leaders and the vendor. More oftentimes the vendor may not even speak to the end user. So one thing that we actually hold our high-risk vendors accountable to is performing either a monthly business review or a quarterly business review, again, based on impact to the operation, to spend, etc. But we'll essentially bring all parties together to talk about, okay, this is what we've done either in the last month or the last quarter, but also it gives the vendor an opportunity to really hear from the end user where there's areas to improve, any obviously pain points, and then obviously thinking about, hey, are there other services that actually might benefit the organization to engage with that vendor on? So I think, that process is good that you've got on the screen there. But again, as you go granular, it's about bringing the vendor and the business unit together so that they're really aligned. It kind of goes a bit deeper than just that typical, hey, we've signed the contract, let's do business.
Yep. And Steve, you and I talked about this the other day, and I think this was a really great conversation that we had, because I can see this from the perspective of a vendor myself, and also a client of several vendors, right? And in my role as a client, when I have these vendor meetings with folks, let's say my competitive intelligence folks or my training platform, the other people that I'm using, it tends to deepen that relationship with them. I know who to call. I know who I can rely on. I know what they're providing me. I feel that sense of the value add, and then also as the vendor, we do the same for our clients, right? Based on, some criteria, we're having regular meeting with clients, trying to talk about how we can help solve problems, making sure we understand any of the issues that they're having with our offerings currently, and trying to deepen that relationship. So I think, going back to the earlier comments, having that line of communication is super important. And knowing that I can pick up the phone and call someone is great, but also having that relationship and building that over time is even better for both parties. So I think that's awesome advice from your perspective as well.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Next slide. Due diligence. Really what we're looking at here is kind of, if we're going to conduct due diligence, we kind of look at it in a funnel, right? It's inductive, right? And so that's what we're looking at here. We can do third-party audits. We can do, IT audits, authentication, workflow. Without getting too deep into this, and I know this is relatively vague. It's supposed to be kind of, just vanilla. When you're doing due diligence, Steve, what are the things that and we're got a slide coming up with some more stuff, but what are some of the things that you're keying on, especially now in our risk environment, when you're conducting either initial or ongoing due diligence?
So, you have the standards, looking at financials, looking at maybe a SOC report, issuing one of the hundreds vendor management questionnaires that you can find either from other providers, or just Google will throw up a few questionnaires as well, which people put them online. But those are kind of like they're fundamental in that sense. But really right now, we're really looking at how that vendor is operating. One of the things that, we've just gone through COVID. So the immediate risk there was, okay, vendors now, like lenders, were sending people to work from home. So again, you start to think about it. Okay, so how are they accessing the work that they'll be working on? Are they on a laptop? Are they on any laptop? Are they sat in a cafe? Or are they being given company computers to go and work on, where there's much more, security features involved, such as, the USB is disabled, so they can't go downloading, borrow information. So we try to think about, we've got those fundamental parts of vendor due diligence, but now we're looking at, okay, how are they working today and how are they performing, and kind of monitoring that, and then kind of joining up the dots, seeing what red flags we've got to kind of follow. So again, if they're working from home, does that now translate into maybe there's a delay in them taking up an escalation point? It's very difficult to manage some folks when they're working remotely because you just don't see them. So we want to make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page there. And then we also look at things when it comes to like cybersecurity. I mean, every other day right now, there's some type of breach, and we know that the regulators are looking at those breaches. And therefore, it's a case of when we hear of a breach, we may not know if that vendor's using that type of software that was just hacked, essentially. But we then are very proactive by going out to the market, to our vendor database, and actually asking them the question like, hey, we've noticed this breach in the press. Were you a victim of that? Because again, we all have a duty of care. And again, based on the contract, they also have a duty to actually notify of breaches. Plus, you have the fact that you've got state legislation that does vary, as every state does, but they all have to maybe notify states when there's a breach. So we're really looking at the granular level when it comes to really watching them, if you will.
Yep, and I like the fact that we're going to get into contract management too, and so that's also important, especially when we talk about breach or data privacy. That's all really great part about sound contract management, and we're certainly going to talk about that here shortly. So if we can go to the next slide, please. I think this is just a really great recap of what we just discussed. And if you're new to vendor management, this is probably something that you might want to hang on to. This is a really great kind of basic what you're looking for. If they have financials, we definitely want to make sure they're a going concern. Obviously, if you're a technology vendor, we want to have a SOC report. DR plans and testing, obviously that's very important. InfoSec policy, security awareness, background checks. And again, if they're you may want to get insurance with yourself as lost payee if that's depending on the type of vendor. again, document-wise, I think this is kind of the basic that we're looking for. Anything you'd add here as far as documentation goes, Steve?
So, I mean, this is a good kind of foundation for information, but again, even to a point of, there was a talk a few months ago about vendor fatigue, that vendors have to continually fill out these hundreds of questionnaires that they get bombarded with. So one tactic that actually might help a vendor manager just to kind of get up to speed is request if they have a vendor management package. If there's if they have a SIG report, which is kind of an industry standard vendor management due diligence questionnaire, and it's very, very in depth. I mean, literally thousands of questions that they can essentially attempt to answer. But anything that they have already to kind of make a preemptive strike to help you get comfortable with them is going to help you along the way, because again, the more questions that are asked, the more data that you have to make an informed decision.
Yep, excellent. So if we want to move on to the next slide, this one, again, we can talk about all day. And this really, to me, really speaks to when we talk about onboarding tech vendors, especially, or anyone that we consider to be a critical vendor. What we're looking at here is the IIA's 3 lines model. The IIA is the Association of Internal Auditors. And really, they're the ones that have developed kind of the preeminent risk model that's in use in financial institutions. And why this is important, and just to get it from a high level overview, is when we evaluate a tech vendor or a critical vendor, we're really not only looking at documents, but we're looking at and trying to understand what their internal control environment looks like, okay? And so that's what we're seeing here, is we want to make sure that they've got internal controls placed in more than one spot, right? So we have the first line of defense would be your frontline folks, the second line of defense would be your management and your audit folks, and the third line would be internal audit. You can see that they communicate with each other and send information and reporting along. But also, we want to take that information, and if we see any gaps there, we can put complementary controls in place at our institution so that we make sure that we're shoring up any gaps that we see. And again, as a risk manager, I can talk about that all day, but just to give you an idea of when you're reviewing those documents, these are the types of things that you should be looking for, and the kind of the types of questions that you want to ask yourself. Steve, any additional comments on risk?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is absolutely necessary to run a tight program. It's going to fall into, your ERM and your CMS programs, but essentially, it goes back to when you're creating a program, you're writing your policy and procedures, you've really got to make sure that if you write it down, that becomes now the record. It's what you're going to use for your FANI approval, amongst others. But it now becomes like, if you say that's what you do, then you better be able to prove it. And the nice thing about internal audit is that they will actually keep you honest by running you through exactly what the regulators are going to look at. So they will look at your policy and procedure, and they will ask for evidence of that. Because when it does come to like a MORA review, let's say, that's the type of information you're going to be requested to provide. So it's not just, oh, here's my policy and procedure. They will look at, okay, share me with your vendor database. How are you managing those vendors? And they will start to go deep. And obviously from another control perspective, it's really, really important that, again, you can't just tell your board at the end of the year that these are the issues that you're having. It has to be an ongoing process. So, personally, we run a quarterly vendor management committee where all things vendor management get put onto the table. We assess risk as they're popping up anyway throughout the months, but it really kind of puts some good bookends throughout the quarter. So everyone has visibility into what the issues are, what the risk is, and how to remediate that risk moving forward.
Excellent. So if we can go to the next slide here, we have built in here, the next several slides are more going to be perfect. They're going to be more tactical in nature. So these are really better takeaways. We're not going to really cover all the bullet points on them, but I can tell you, we've already talked about pre-screening. We've already covered all of this. And so I think we're good on that one. If we go to the next one, Steve, I'll let you, I'm sorry, next slide, please, sorry. There we go. I'll kind of let you cover this one. Back one, I'm sorry. Did we miss contracts?
Yeah, there we go.
There we go. When you're looking at, and I know what I used to look at, but when you're looking at a contract, what are the most important things? Because again, I think there's some subtle differences in industry here. So I want the folks to hear from you as far as what's most important to you. If you got the top 3 or top 5 things when you're looking at a contract, what's really important to you?
So, The SLA is really a standard, so I wouldn't say that it's my top 5. It is a standard that we obviously have to monitor, and we'll monitor that by working with the lines of business, by reporting, in part by verifying through the MBR or the QBR with the vendor. But part of like the controls are in place, are really looking at things like, okay, so the effective date, how long is the term of the engagement? Are there ways to exit that? Are there, is it you can only exit because there's a breach, meaning either a data breach or a breach of contract, meaning that they're not being able to meet an SLA. Other things that I'm looking at, auto renews. So, a lot of vendors will like a 3-year contract because it's 3 years of revenue they can account for. So looking at a 3-year term and then with an auto renew, unless you have a good contract management system in place, which is not Excel, it's not using calendar updates on Outlook, it's actually a software that you can look at many different versions of it online, but actually captures the contracts information and then will actually remind all stakeholders that something's coming up for renewal. Those are the types of things where there's big risk, because again, there's nothing worse. And I did have a personal experience at another employer where there was a need to actually exit a very in-depth relationship with a vendor. And to move to that vendor required a good 90 days notice, but actually bringing on a new vendor replacement would take about 18 months. The cutoff had been missed because at the time there wasn't any kind of contractual controls to monitor those dates. So when the CEO walked into the office and said, hey, I want to do this, my immediate answer was, we really can't until the next renewal period comes up. So those are the things that you've got to look at regarding, the contracts. And obviously, when it comes to, vendor management and looking at auditing a vendor, you've got to make sure that you've got the right to audit in there, because if it's not in the contract, the vendor could push back, and that's actually going to put you at a lot of risk if you're now being audited by an agency. And the answer to say, hey, my vendor said they don't have to because it's out of contract, that's going to be a really difficult conversation. So I want to make sure that I've got the right to audit.
Yeah, I think those are great too. Those would probably be in my top as well. So if we can go to the next slide there. This is ongoing monitoring, and really we've covered this again. The goal is here to make sure that vendor is meeting those obligations and not posing you any risk that you're not aware of. And again, I think these bullet points, many of which we've covered, but also really make a great kind of tactical blueprint for the folks in the call. If we go to the next one, just some other things to think about as far as ensuring that third-party compliance. We talked about the vendor fitting in with strategy. We talked about looking at their risk assessments, as well as that the CMS, so the compliance management system, the control environment we talked about. So I think we're good on this slide. But I did want to spend a couple minutes, and I know we're running on time, and we want to make sure that we've got some time for questions. There are really two topics I want to hit for just a brief minute. The first is fourth-party risk. So as Steve mentioned, when we look at the SOC reports of vendors, that's going to be the audit of that vendor, right? And it's going to tell us a lot about that vendor's control environment, but will also tell us if they use fourth-party vendors, right? And so it's basically your vendor's vendor. And we have seen with the regulatory community the expectation of you having an understanding of who that vendor is and what controls that your vendor has over that fourth party, right? And we're going to look for things like, hey, does the contract include an assignment clause, right? Because if it does, we don't really know who those fourth party vendors might be. But also, if we see things in the SOC report, we want to make sure we conduct due diligence on that fourth party vendor. We might want to request and review the fourth party vendors SOC reports, and some other things of that nature. But I think, and I can tell you from my experience, I had a regulator say exactly that. Well, your vendor, my core processing vendor was using Amazon Web Services. So I went out and I requested and very quickly skimmed the 500-page SOC report for Amazon Web Services. But I can tell you from my personal experience, that was an expectation and that did happen. So Steve, what are we seeing nowadays with fourth-party risk? Are you running into this with your regulators, or how are you handling that?
So we're handling it in a very similar fashion. I will tell you, there's a little bit of a blind spot, I feel, when you're working directly with a vendor where they have a service. and they're using a fourth party vendor to maybe perform some of that. That's one thing, and you should definitely be aware of those vendors and join up the dots. One thing that I think for the lending industry is the resellers. So these are essentially resellers that are selling a product that you may be able to order through their portal. But you've got to make sure from a reseller perspective, is that reseller performing vendor oversight on that party? Because again, they are taking borrowed data from the organization, and you might not be aware of that. And you kind of find out from your research. You look at your contracts because it should identify where that product is coming from. But it's definitely something that if it's a reseller, not maybe not, you're not paying the reseller, you're paying the vendor directly. You've really got to look at where that vendor's coming from and if there's any oversights available for them. So again, I would say for the lending industry, look at your resellers that are selling multiple products from other vendors. That's something you should be aware of.
Excellent, great point. All right, one more quick topic I wanted to hit was cyber monitoring. So if we can go to that next slide. I know, Steve, we talked about this a lot. We've also mentioned it earlier in our discussion today. You can't talk about vendor risk without talking about cyber attacks, right? Because reputational risk says if that vendor has a cyber attack and they have my data, now our risks are linked, right? Our fates are linked, that type of thing. So if you have a critical vendor or a vendor that has access to non-public personal, one of the things we want to think about is, do we want to have a software solution that monitors those vendors and their cyber posture on an ongoing basis so that we can be more proactive if we start to see a deterioration in their cyber condition that might lead to a cyber attack? So not an attack has occurred, let's do something about it, but let's evaluate their cyber posture and make sure that we're doing things proactively. And again, I don't want to go over all the bullets on the slide, but what's your take on cyber monitoring, Steve? What do we think the benefits of that are, or what's your advice there?
So I think, if you look at the hacker, they're not coming. I mean, they are making the phishing attempts and everything else with any company, any size as well. But they're really looking at the smaller vendors that may be less sophisticated, don't have the funds to invest in cyber, have lax controls when it comes to managing cybersecurity. They're looking for an in. That I think most people have heard the Target tale of how it was a HVACC vendor that came in, worked on Target systems. They had access to everything, and it was the HVAC vendor that actually been hacked a while ago, if you will, where the hacker was just monitoring the systems. When they got into Target, it was game over, and obviously there was a pretty big event there from a breach perspective. But I mean, you've got to be looking at your vendors, and you've got to be asking them, have they got a cybersecurity program in place to protect themselves? Because ultimately, if they're working in your systems, hackers will find a way in.
Excellent. So next slide, we're going to do some quick hits, and then we're going to get right on to questions. So Steve, take it away. Just give us the top couple bullet points here that are really going to hammer home what we've talked about today.
Sure. So you can't manage what you don't know. I would really encourage everyone to go take stock of all the vendors. You'll be amazed at how many vendors that maybe AP are either paying from another line of business, or maybe it's an electronic agreement from a line of business that are paying from their own personal credit card. Really got to take stock of your vendors, and then obviously if there are vendors that you identify that you didn't know about, get the information, perform a risk assessment, implement due diligence, and make everyone aware that this is what you're doing. Break down the silo. Simply, your first line of defense, your business unit operators, they're going to give you a wealth of information about how your vendors are performing. So if you're a vendor performance manager and you're purely looking at SLAs, that operation outlet is going to give you a lot of information to help you. And it kind of goes back into creating feedback loops. Again, you don't know what you don't know, so asking those questions from the business will really help you working with the vendors moving forward. And again, I find that I've been in the business a long time now, and I'm friendly with a lot of vendors, but we've really got to a point where a vendor really should be a partner. If you're going to treat them as an extension of your department, then they're there to pick up the phone late at night when something's gone wrong and answer that call, if you will. So really look at working with them. I've not met a vendor yet that didn't want to cooperate if I identified a risk, because my common sense is, if I've identified a risk, you've probably got other clients that are also looking at you, and that won't help you in the long run. So just kind of partner with vendors. And then the last two here really is, the business reviews. I think this is really helpful as well. I'm amazed at how many vendors don't always offer that as a service unless you actually ask them to come in and actually give you a business review. It's a great way to get, pain points and other kind of opportunities to improve on the table. And then the last one really is, break away from that idea that vendor management is just a one and done type of process. It's more than a questionnaire. It's more than an annual practice. It really is a 365 life cycle.
Well, all right. Thank you, Steve. Well said. So we did it. Everyone's vendor managers. We've got 5 minutes to go. That's perfect. Everyone's an expert. So do we have any questions from our attendees?
Yeah, thank you guys. You did an amazing job. That's a lot of fantastic information. Sam, did we get any questions?
No, we haven't had any questions come in yet, but just as a quick reminder, we do have a questions Q&A box in your control panel. If you guys would like to submit any questions for Steve or Paul, feel free to do that. We have a few minutes left.
Well, any last comments or any Q&As that you guys normally get?
Nothing comes to mind, but I do want to say thanks for the invite. Really appreciate being here. It was nice meeting y'all and really great working with Steve. I learned some things about vendor management, and any day that I can learn something, that's a good day for me.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, I'll just leave one tidbit as well is if you're managing vendors today via Excel spreadsheet, really look at the vendors in the market that actually specialize in vendor management, both from a professional services where they're performing risk oversight for you. You obviously have to sign off on the findings, but also look at software that can actually help you automate and streamline some of the process, because the GSEs are not looking at you to manage vendors by Excel anymore. That they've shifted the goalpost there.
And I'll build on that. Maybe I'm a little partial here, but one of the other nice things is if you do engage a vendor, we know that vendor management is very labor intensive. And so through software and through related services, you can actually streamline. And again, now knowing what the industry is going through, streamline makes a lot of sense, better, faster, smarter. And so, an expense on vendor management is going to save you countless other things down the road, whether it's more full-time employees or that type of thing, or regulatory problems. So yes, Steve, thanks for doing my job for me. Appreciate that one.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Paul and Samantha.
We did have one question come in. How often should you audit your high-risk vendors?
I think I'll take that one.
Yeah, please.
As a standard, I would be looking at annually in the sense of a questionnaire, but I think what happens is you should be looking at all of the documents that you collect. And I would caution you from just saying, okay, all of these other documents, maybe it's insurance or W-9 licenses, don't wait for them to just come up for the annual review. You should be gathering that data, those documents, new documents, as they expire. So that's one thing you should do. If you're managing the vendor where maybe there's a risk involved, where maybe there's a performance issue, maybe they're hurting financially, anything that you find about them outside of your annual review, you should go back and re-audit and actually verify those questions that you're concerned about. It might not mean that you have to do a full review, and you can kind of like laser in on those specific issues, but at least once a year and maybe twice a year for a high-risk vendor that may be struggling.
Thank you. Oh, Sam, you're on. There you go.
Sorry. That was the only question we had submitted, so we can probably wrap up here. Just thank you to everyone who joined with us this morning, and thank you to Steve and Paul for your time and efforts with this webinar today. Please look for our next MQAC webinar for September 22nd. We will be covering California state exams with Jerry Hager from AmeriHome and Raymond from First Line Compliance. So just thank you all for joining us this morning. Anything else you have, Paula, before we sign off?
No, that's all. We hope we see you at the conference.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. And thanks again, Steve and Paul, for your time.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Take care.